our Democratic Party chair, Cardall Coleman, he beat me to the punch, as myself and Colin all read. We're about to file a lawsuit.
In a dramatic turn of events on election night, Democratic leaders in Dallas County announced that they were preparing to file a lawsuit after voting polls were reportedly shut down earlier than expected, potentially preventing some voters from casting their ballots. The announcement came during a tense gathering where Democratic officials addressed supporters and explained the unfolding legal battle. The situation quickly escalated into a major political controversy, raising serious questions about voter access, election procedures, and the role of the courts in determining how long polls should remain open. According to party officials, the issue began earlier in the evening when voters started reporting problems at polling locations across the county. These reports came through phone calls, emails, and direct messages from residents who said they were experiencing difficulties voting. Democratic leaders say the volume of complaints was significant enough to trigger immediate concern. Many voters reportedly claimed that long lines, technical issues, and confusion at polling locations were preventing them from casting their ballots in a timely manner. Because of these problems, party officials began coordinating with legal teams in order to ensure that every voter who arrived before the closing time would have an opportunity to vote. During a public statement, one Democratic leader explained that the party chair, Cardall Coleman, had already begun taking action. "Our Democratic Party chair, Cardall Coleman, actually beat me to the punch," the speaker said. "Myself and Colin Allred were about to file a lawsuit to keep the voting polls open." The crowd responded with cheers as the announcement was made, reflecting both relief and frustration among supporters who had been following the developments throughout the evening. The legal effort was aimed at extending voting hours so that individuals who had been delayed due to reported issues could still participate in the election. According to the officials speaking at the event, their initial efforts were successful. They confirmed that a court order had temporarily allowed the polls to remain open longer than originally scheduled. "We were able to keep the polls open," the speaker told the audience. However, the situation remains complicated and uncertain. Even though the extension allowed some additional voters to cast their ballots, Democratic leaders warned that many individuals may still have been disenfranchised. "I can tell you now that people have been disenfranchised," the speaker said. The claim immediately sparked concern among voters and political observers who were already closely watching the election. Election-related lawsuits and court orders are not uncommon in closely contested races, especially when logistical problems arise at polling locations. However, disputes over poll closing times can be particularly sensitive because they directly impact voters' ability to participate in the democratic process. According to the statement made during the event, the party had been monitoring reports from voters throughout the evening. "The reason that we knew there were problems is because we were receiving the phone calls and the emails," the speaker explained. These reports suggested that several polling locations were experiencing delays that prevented voters from completing the voting process before the original closing time. To address the issue, Democratic officials sought legal intervention to extend voting hours. They argued that voters who arrived at polling locations before the scheduled closing time should not be turned away simply because lines were too long or because operational problems slowed the process. A judge initially agreed with that argument. According to the officials speaking that evening, the court issued an order allowing polling locations to stay open until 9 p.m. This ruling meant that voters who were still waiting in line after the normal closing time would have the opportunity to cast their ballots. For a brief period, it appeared that the situation had been resolved. However, the legal battle did not end there. In a sudden and unexpected development, the state Supreme Court reportedly intervened. "The Supreme Court just a few minutes ago said shut it down," the speaker told the audience. The announcement shocked many supporters gathered at the event. Just moments earlier, they had been celebrating what appeared to be a successful legal victory that would allow more voters to participate. Instead, the higher court's decision effectively reversed the earlier extension and ordered the polls to close. The sudden change created confusion for voters who may have joined the line after the original closing time, but before the extended 9 p.m. deadline. Once there was a court order saying you had until 9, I'm sure that there were people that joined the line after 7, the speaker said. Now those voters could face uncertainty about whether their ballots would count. Election officials reportedly responded to the Supreme Court's ruling by instructing poll workers to separate certain ballots. Specifically, ballots cast during the disputed time period would be kept separate from other votes. They're telling them that you have to separate the votes out, the speaker explained. This procedure is often used in elections when there is a legal dispute over the validity of certain ballots. By separating the ballots, officials ensure that they can later include or exclude them depending on how courts ultimately rule. However, this process can also delay the final results of an election. Because the ballots must remain isolated until the legal issue is resolved, they cannot be immediately counted with the rest of the votes. As a result, Democratic leaders warned that election results from Dallas County would likely remain uncertain for some time. What this means is that we will not know what votes are to be tallied from Election Day out of Dallas County, the speaker said. This announcement signaled that the county's results might not be finalized on election night. In many elections, media outlets and political campaigns rely on preliminary vote counts to project winners. But when ballots are separated due to legal disputes, those projections become much more difficult. In some cases, the outcome of an election may remain unclear for days while courts review the situation. The speaker emphasized that this uncertainty meant that supporters should prepare for a longer wait. For sure, we won't know that tonight, they said. The crowd, which had been energized earlier in the evening, reacted with a mix of disappointment and determination. Many had gathered expecting to celebrate a victory, or at least learn the initial results. Instead, they were now facing the possibility that the final outcome could be delayed. But despite the uncertainty, the speaker encouraged supporters to remain positive. "I want you to enjoy yourselves," they told the audience. But they also made it clear that the evening's schedule had changed dramatically. "I won't be back tonight," the speaker said. Because of the unresolved legal issues surrounding the ballots, there was simply no way to know when the final results would become available. "I have no idea when we're going to get results," the speaker added. The speaker concluded by saying they expected the process to continue into the following day. "I fully anticipate it won't be until tomorrow." The situation in Dallas County highlights how complex election administration can become when legal challenges arise. Poll closing times, voter access, and ballot handling procedures are all governed by strict laws and regulations designed to protect the integrity of the electoral process. When unexpected problems occur, courts often become involved in determining how those rules should be applied. Supporters of the poll extension argued that it was necessary to protect voters who were delayed through no fault of their own. They say that individuals who arrived at polling locations before the deadline should be allowed to vote, even if lines were too long or because operational problems slowed the process. On the other hand, critics of such extensions argue that changing poll hours during an election can create confusion and undermine confidence in the process. They believe that election rules should remain consistent, and last-minute legal changes can introduce uncertainty. Because of these competing perspectives, courts must carefully balance voter access with the need for clear and consistent election procedures. The decision by the state Supreme Court to shut down the extended voting hours indicates that the justices may have believed the original deadline should remain in place. However, the decision to separate the disputed ballots leaves open the possibility that those votes could still be counted, depending on future legal rulings. In the meantime, election officials will continue processing the ballots that were cast before the dispute. Those votes can be counted and reported normally, but the separated ballots will remain in legal limbo until the courts determine their fate. Political analysts say that in close elections, even a relatively small number of disputed ballots can become extremely important. If the margin between candidates is narrow, the outcome could depend on whether those ballots are counted. For voters in Dallas County, the situation serves as a reminder that elections don't always end when the polls close. Sometimes the most important battles take place in courtrooms rather than polling stations. As legal teams prepare their arguments and judges review the case, the entire country will be watching to see how the dispute is resolved. For now, the only certainty is uncertainty. Election night celebrations have turned into a waiting game, and the final results remain just out of reach. Supporters who gathered expecting answers must now wait until the legal process runs its course. Whether the disputed ballots will be counted and what impact they might have remains an open question. But one thing is clear: the fight over Dallas County's votes is far from over.